injuries that would have been the cause of her death?
The only that would be the cause of her death, no.
Can you walk us through how you ended up reaching your conclusion that this was the cause of death was asphyxiation?
Sure. Um, so as I was just asked, we didn't find any traumatic injury that would explain her death. We also didn't find any natural disease that would explain her death. Her heart was completely normal. Her lungs were normal, except for some fluid buildup in them. Her liver, kidneys, all of her organs were normal. And so we did not identify an anatomic or pathologic explanation for her death. She did have the only real finding she had, apart from, no lethal trauma and no significant natural disease, was some bruising on her arms and one bruise on her chest. Um, and then when we get to that point, essentially no findings that will explain the death directly, then there are a limited number of things that can explain a death in that context. One is asphyxia. Obviously, that's what we ruled it to be. And that can be, any number of things that, as I discussed, that can lead to asphyxia. But in this case, we believe primarily was related to some form of suffocation, and even acquired forms of heart rhythm disturbances that can lead to a sudden death with nothing for us to see at autopsy. And then obviously drug intoxications don't leave anything for us to see. She did have, as I said, some fluid in her lungs. That's a very common finding in the setting of drug deaths. And one of the reasons that we spent a lot of time trying to evaluate for intoxicants that might possibly have led to her death.
And if we break that down a little bit, and I don't know if you use this term, but negative autopsy, can you explain what a negative autopsy is?
Yeah, essentially what I was just getting at, where we don't have findings, we don't have pathology, we don't have trauma that explains death. We have essentially normal, a person with normal anatomy who has died.
And so in this case, when we talk about it being a negative autopsy, is that because there was not a clear way to determine the cause of death right away?
Yes.
And you talked about one of the other potentials when you're dealing with a negative autopsy as being seizures. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about what a seizure is?
Sure. A seizure is a manifestation externally in some fashion of abnormal electrical discharges in the brain. That can be what you typically think of as a seizure, where someone goes stiff and collapses and then convulses. People can also have what are called partial seizures, where they may have, movement of one part of their body, or they may have um, staring spells or other things of that nature as a result of seizure activity. But it's abnormal electrical changes in the brain that result in abnormal behavior, usually associated with loss of consciousness, and also not under the person's control. They just happen.
Have you conducted autopsies before where there were signs that a seizure had occurred or there had been seizure activity?
Yes.
And where would those signs usually show up?
So there's a number of ways. Sometimes those signs show up in the body. Sometimes they show up in the medical records. There's a variety of ways that we have to, evaluate the role of seizures in a death. From a historical standpoint, if somebody has a history of epilepsy, then obviously that, can contribute. But looking at the person's body, the main things that we might see would be things that you would expect, trauma to the person's tongue, for example, and that can be recent or old. Um, and then evidence of incontinence of either bowel or bladder. Those would be the primary two main physical findings that we might see, but certainly people with seizures are known to die suddenly and unexpectedly in the absence of having had a recent seizure. Having seizures, having a diagnosis of epilepsy puts you at risk for sudden death. And so it's not, certainly we don't have to have those things if someone has a well-established history to attribute their death to a seizure disorder or epilepsy. But in the absence of significant history and the absence of anatomic findings, we don't generally are not going to call a death as seizure related. And it's also not uncommon for people to have seizures as a terminal event. If, for example, you have a heart attack and your heart's not beating normally and your brain's not getting enough oxygen, you may seize. Or if you're diabetic,